Now that we have a better understanding about how Azure Autoscale works from a high level, let's start digging into things and we'll build a virtual machine scale set. So to start here in the portal, I've got a resource group called Web Servers. And you can see inside the resource group, I simply have one resource. It's a virtual network that's going to provide the virtual network for my virtual machines in the scale set. So what we want to do now is go over to create a resource. And what I'll do is just search for scale set, and we'll create a virtual machine scale set. So this gives us some information about how things work. Basically what this is going to do is it's going to build a virtual machine scale set and give us the option to create an Azure load balancer, which we're going to dig into in more detail later in the course. But let's go ahead and click on create. And then we just got to fill out a few things here. So we'll call this my VM scale set. And for the operating system disk image, instead of Windows, what I'll do here is pick CentOS, since that'll boot a little bit quicker. We'll go ahead and put this in the web servers resource group, because that resource group is in the West US. But notice that for availability zone, this is basically set to none. It's grayed out. And then we get this message here saying that this region does not yet support availability zones. However, if it did, we could basically pick the availability zones we wanted from a drop-down list. So for example, if this was on something like West US 2, for example, we could say availability zone, and we could say put our virtual machines in both zone 1 and zone 2. So not only would that give us great elasticity in our application, but it'll give us high availability across two different zones within that particular region. We'll go ahead and switch the location back to West US because that's where my original resource group and virtual network is. And we want to provide credentials for each virtual machine in the scale set. So I'll put sysadmin as a username, and we'll just do a quick password here. And so with the credentials set that each virtual machine is going to get, we'll scroll down and we'll see that we can start off with 2 instances. We can change this here. This is basically setting the default. We could pick a different instance type or size if we want here for virtual machine size. And then one important concept here is you notice it says deploy as low priority. And when you hover over the information icon here, it tells you that if you choose to say yes to this option, that could give you the ability to save up to 80% on the typical on-demand cost for virtual machines, because low priority essentially means that the Azure platform could take away your virtual machines at any given time. And this is basically to give other users or other businesses on the platform their reserved capacity that they have prepaid for. So kind of interesting feature here that you can take advantage of if you're trying to save on costs and if you have stateless applications that don't need to have anything stored locally. Just remember that if you pick this option, the virtual machines in the scale set can be removed at any time by the Azure team. But then from there, we've got managed disk support. We'll leave that enabled. You can see down here, Autoscale can be turned on at this point. You can start building out your rules. We'll do that in the next video. So for now, I'm going to create the group with Autoscale disabled, and we'll manually set that up later. And as we get down to the bottom of the screen here, that kind of just leaves us with networking considerations. And we're going to talk more about load balancers as we move forward here. You can see we've got support for something called an application gateway or just a general Azure load balancer. And then for this infrastructure, we want to go ahead and fill out some information. You can also set this to none. But typically when you're working with a virtual machine scale set, you want to have a single entry point where you can get to something like a web application. And that's why the load balancer is typically used with this type of environment. So I'll give the public IP address resource a name here. And we'll do the same thing for the actual DNS name for the load balancer. We'll just make sure that's a unique value. Finally, as we scroll down, we'll pick the virtual network. This is the one that we had already deployed previously. And we'll go ahead and use the individual subnet, the only subnet that's in that virtual network right now. And then finally here, we don't want to give a public IP address to our instances, our virtual machines, because we're going to have a public IP address on the load balancer. So there's no need to do that. So with that, let's go ahead and click on the create button here. That'll kick off the deployment process. So this is going to build not only a load balancer, but it's going to build a scalable group of virtual machines, a virtual machine scale set. So let's give this a minute to run, and then we'll jump into the resource group and take a look at what it deployed. All right, so after a couple minutes, the deployment has succeeded. So let's head over to that resource. And we can see we've got the virtual machine scale set here that's up and running. Let's go to instances. We can see that we've got 2 running instances inside this group. And if we go to scaling, we can see that Autoscale is currently disabled. So that's a process of deploying the virtual machine scale set. And obviously there's a lot we can do with this infrastructure. In the next video, we're going to enable Autoscale. But let me also show you the resource group first. So we can see in the resource group, we've got a public IP address that's bound to our load balancer. We've got a security group for our virtual machines, and we've got the virtual machine scale set here. So remember that as you're designing a highly available architecture, if you plan to use a scale set for one or more tiers of the application, it's just going to show up here as a single resource, and you got to drill into it and then go to instances to see the individual instances. Okay, so let's go ahead and head to the next video, and we'll set up auto scaling for this virtual machine scale set.